it really is wonderful to be here, and I'll just introduce our panel, though you may well know them. We have Christopher Hobbs, the composer and founder of EMC. We have Hugh Shrapnel, experimental composer, member of the Scratch Orchestra. Virginia Anderson, who works very tirelessly at the EMC and runs the website. And you're the sort of webmeister, aren't you, of the EMC, basically?
Web thingy is
web thingy. The web thingy, even. And we have John White, another wonderful composer who was, like Chris and Hugh, a member of the Scratch Orchestra. So I'm going to start by asking Chris a little, and I know Virginia has covered a little of this, but just to give you a bit of background. Chris, why did you set up the Experimental Music Catalogue? Why did you think we needed a catalogue?
Well, I think there was a lot happening in the late 1960s in Britain, and there were a lot of scores floating around from people, not only from those of us who were associated with Cornelius Cardew, but because of Cardew's travels and also the travels of John Tilbury, the pianist with whom he was very closely associated, between them and between us, we'd accumulated a lot of scores, most of which were very bad copies, photocopies. Just cast your mind back, remember that photocopying was actually very bad in those days. And so it was difficult for people who were interested in playing new music to get their hands on it. Most of it wasn't published because conventional publishers wouldn't touch it because they knew they wouldn't sell enough to make a reasonable profit. And the cost of actually getting typesetting a piece of music, some of which were not very conventionally notated. You see the problems that John Cage had with Henmar Press, that the reproduction qualities, which were bad die-line prints, were atrocious and were sold for huge sums of money. And so it seemed logical to gather all of the music which had been accumulated into under one roof, so to speak. And so I agreed to kind of do that job, to curate the collections of music which Tilbury and Cardew had, and also the music by myself and my associates at the Academy and other people whom we knew.
And were you a naturally organised person, or did you have to kind of learn the cataloguing skills as you went on?
There weren't any cataloguing skills. We get a piece of music, I get another piece of music, and eventually I put out, send around a Xeroxed list of what we had, and I would price it according to how much it cost to reproduce. So reproduction those days was quite simple. I think it was mentioned yesterday that I would go to the Royal Academy of Music, get on the photocopier, and pay sixpence, that's 6 old pence, which is quite a lot of money in those days, to get one A4 page. So calculating how many pages there were, how much it would cost to post it to somebody, so non-profit making basically, but at least there was a way of getting a list together so people knew that if they wrote to me and said, can we have this particular piece, I could then give it to them rather than then having to chase up Tilbury or Cardew, who led very busy lives, didn't have time to respond to this kind of thing. And it went on from there. And the name Experimental Music Catalogue just sort of came out of the blue. It was experimental music, and it was literally a catalogue. So that was it.
Well, that brings me on to my next point in a way, because I want to bring John and Hugh in here, and Virginia as well, but what about the label experimental? How did it feel then? Did it feel like a good fit then? I mean, how did you feel about it, Hugh?
I've always been puzzled by the term experimental music, although it's always been, you know, that's always been the term. I was puzzled and possibly a bit doubtful about it, in the sense that it's always to me suggested like something has to be in a laboratory, something a bit clinical. But of course it's not. It's the opposite of that. It's, and I've always been thinking, is there a better word? But experimental music it is. It's like a. It's,
well, John,
so I've retreated from that.
Is there a better word? Have you ever thought of a better word?
Well, it's a label rather than a real a real description. I think there are a lot of us who felt a bit tormented in the early 60s by the need for new music to follow a certain pattern. That was the pattern established by the second Viennese school. That I mean, while I was a student at college during the 50s, and while I was teaching there during the 60s, anybody who didn't write 12-tone music was Neanderthal. And it was such a relief to run into Cornelius Cardew, who I suppose was one of the inventors of performance art. In the Scratch Orchestra we did pieces that involved the whole of Richmond Park, pieces that involved the whole of the circle line of the underground. They were kind of extravagant manifestations, and in that way I think the word experiment is appropriate. Yes, I think that there was a kind of loosening up, so that instead of being forced to do a certain kind of modern music, we found ways of performing that were new to us and probably were new to a lot of our audiences also. Very liberating and very exciting at the time.
And Virginia, now you're very, very strongly involved in the running of EMC. Do you also have a very clear feeling of what kind of a piece fits in the catalogue and what isn't quite your territory?
What I have is an idea of experimental music as not being a certain technique, which is what a lot of people define experimental music as, whether it's indeterminate or it's various kinds of other technical terms. What I've found is that I like the music of the indeterminate experimental music, and then when the composers went off and started writing piano sonatas, well, you wrote them before, but everybody else with sonatinas and tonal pieces and whatever, it still was that alternative to the whole second Viennese school, that I thought that it was actually a cultural element. And so I've kept the experimental music logo for that. So you might get extended tonal sonatas or sonatinas, or you might get a text piece.
So,
I think another thing to point out is there was seen to be a dichotomy at that time between European avant-garde and American avant-garde. That we've referred to the Second Viennese School and the subsequent generation after Schoenberg and Weber, which would be Boulez and Stockhausen and their acolytes and disciples. And on the other hand, the disciplines practiced in America by Cage foremost, and those people who are influenced much more by the East than by the European canon of high art. And for want of a better term, the way in which we distinguished the one from the other was to say that the high European art was the avant-garde, and therefore those people who were developed, influenced by that avant-garde, let's say Peter Maxwell Davies, for example, would still be considered avant-garde, whereas the other word is experimental, which can be applied to Cage, Feldman, Wolf, Earl Brown, and those people who are influenced by them, Lamont Young. One wouldn't think of Lamont Young as being an avant-garde composer, although, paradoxically, his string trio, the first piece you wrote, is serial. But it doesn't use any of the gestures which are innate in serialism of its time. It's a piece which lasts almost an hour with hugely long-held sounds, the exact opposite of the kind of cult of personality, if you like, which a Second Viennese School had inherited from Wagner, in the end, of self-expression. So avant-garde music, if you like, is about self-expression. Experimental music was more about the music expresses itself, which is what Cage would have said, rather than expressing the composer's personality. And that, of course, is a very, very sledgehammery kind of dichotomy, and there are lots of grey areas in between it. But if you take those as being the basic blocks of concrete, then you can make your building somewhere in between those.
There are all kinds of implications from, like John was saying, experimental music. It was like a huge influence of Cornelius Cardew in opening the world, like anything can happen, and so like leading away from the sort of, like Chris was saying about the very, for want of a better word, elitist sort of attitude of Boulez and Stockhausen, that modern contemporary music should be available for all, and experimental music had a very big role in that, of course. And, music for amateurs as well as professionals, scratch orchestra and all that.
CoMA.
And CoMA, of course, yeah, not forgetting CoMA.
Sorry, John, if I could just bring you in. I like the term that Chris used about the concrete dichotomy between the avant-garde and perhaps its alternative. Do you still feel that is the case now, or are the boundaries perhaps a little more blurred between the experimental aesthetic and the rest of what's going on in contemporary music?
Well, I think the issue that comes to mind there is the Zen monk who achieved enlightenment and then proceeded to lead his life as normal, except a few millimetres off the ground.
Is that how you feel, Chris, like the Zen monk, a few millimetres off the ground?
Well, I'm also thinking of the cake story about the Zen monk who achieved enlightenment, and I'm just as miserable as I was before.
What about you, Hugh? Did you gain a feeling of enlightenment?
Absolutely. Oh yes, because I was brought up with like Chris was talking about the second Viennese and.
Oh, you studied with
and
Elizabeth
I studied with
Hutchins,
Elizabeth
didn't you?
Hutchins, and at the time I was writing 12-note music, and I produced a piece which had a big octave in the middle, and she said in her low voice, "Hugh, I can detect a C minor at this bar." And, so that was I realised then that my days were as a serialist were numbered. So,
that's what we made manifest later.
but also, like, you know, going back to the catalogue and the early Xeroxes, the Terry Jennings piece, you're playing later on.
Winter Trees, yes.
Winter Trees, that was like a breath of fresh air, because it was like a sort of, it just demonstrated you could write a beautiful piece, inverted commas, tonal, and it was like it was great to hear it. At the time, it had a big influence on.
And going back to how the catalogue began, I mean, to continue the story, I got all these manuscripts, but some of them, the Jennings, for example, the Terry Jennings pieces, were such bad quality Xerox, so they couldn't be Xeroxed again. They would be illegible. So the only way to do it was for me to physically write them out, sticking as close as I could to Jennings' notation, what the music actually looked like on the page. So I wrote it out.